he wanted a fight. He wanted glory, and he was going to see that he got a fight.
Welcome to the GAR, our presentation series. We're all used to doing Zooms. We do meetings and tiring things like that on Zoom. And one of my favorite Zooms are these Zooms because this is where we can sit like we're in a classroom. And we certainly have a teacher with us today. I want to welcome Mark Brewer. He has a Master's of Arts in U.S. History from Temple, which he has put to good use for over 31 years. He taught in public school, county college, university levels. And as he says, Civil War was his first love. So it's no surprise that he has authored two books on this subject, and I'd like him to tell us more about those books. And to no surprise, he also spent some years in the sandbox. So what I mean by that, he was a reenactor for the 4th Texas Infantry. He's a local guy here, so that was a Philly-based organization. And I thank him for his service because he provided a nice target for the boys in blue when they go out and they play. So, if there's anything else you'd like to add to that, and go ahead and start your presentation. And I appreciate you coming and joining us, sir.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I am a retired teacher, and when I was a Confederate reenactor, my aunt, who knew my great-great-grandfather, who was in this battle, used to say that Grandpa Luther is rolling over in his grave because I was a Confederate reenactor. I'd like to thank Brian for setting this up, and I'd like to thank Joseph Perry for having me, and I'd like to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. I appreciate it. My interest in the Battle of Ball's Bluff goes back to the early 1980s when I discovered I had three ancestors there. They were all in the 15th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which is often called the Worcester Regiment, because many of the men were from Worcester and many others were from towns round about. For what it's worth, I was born in Worcester shortly after the Civil War ended. This guy you're seeing in this photo is Second Lieutenant John William Willie Grout. My great aunt, Mary Grout, told me that Willie was a shirt tail relative, not a direct relative. The next picture is of Joseph Hapgood. Joseph Hapgood is my great great uncle. Willie Grout was only 18 when he joined. Joseph Hapgood was 21. The two of them had different experiences joining. Joseph and his older brother Luther, who was 24 at the time, they went to a rally in Leominster, Massachusetts, which is where they were from. They lived on their father's dairy farm. And at this rally, a veteran of the American Revolution spoke to them. He was 98 years old. And afterwards, they signed up, the two of them, for 3 years. So Willie Grout, he was only 18. He was the only son of a family. He had two sisters, and he begged his parents to let him join, and they hemmed and hawed. They didn't want their only son going off to war, but they finally relented. And Willie Grout said that his joy knew no bounds when they let him join. The Battle of Ball's Bluff was fought on October 21st, 1861, exactly 3 months after the Battle of Bull Run, which was a horrible Union defeat. And Ball's Bluff, unfortunately, will also be a terrible defeat for the North. It was a small and somewhat insignificant battle, except to those engaged, but its repercussions were far-reaching. You're looking at a photo here of Brigadier General George Pomeroy Stone. He was in command of a large division of 10,000 men, which occupied the Maryland shore near Poolesville, Maryland. Stone was an 1845 graduate of West Point. He graduated seventh in a class of 41, and he won two brevets in the Mexican War. He had been in charge of security at Abraham Lincoln's inaugural back in March of 1861. Stone's division was called the Corps of Observation, and their job was to keep a lookout at Confederate movements across the Potomac River near the town of Leesburg, Virginia. The regiments in Stone's command included the 15th Massachusetts, the 20th Massachusetts, also known as the Harvard Regiment because so many students and graduates were in that regiment, the 42nd New York, also known as the Tammany Regiment, and the 71st Pennsylvania, which was also known as the California Regiment. The 15th were at the town of Poolesville, a little town of 200, where they camped right on the square. 18-year-old Second Lieutenant Willie Grout gives us some insight as to what his thoughts were. His only surviving letter to his friend Charlie, he wrote, "There are no girls of any account in Poolesville." On Saturday, October 20th, 1861, General Stone received a dispatch from Captain Albert V. Colburn, the Assistant Adjutant General to Commander of the Army of the Potomac, Major General George B. McClellan. This is what it said. General McClellan desires me to inform you that Brigadier General George A. McCall occupied Drainesville yesterday and is still there. We'll send out heavy reconnaissances today in all directions from that point. The general desires that you keep a sharp lookout upon Leesburg to see if this movement has the effect to drive them away. Perhaps a slight demonstration on your part could have the effect to move them. McClellan has been criticized for this vague order. What did slight demonstration mean? Should Stone send troops across the river to reconnoiter? Should he merely send more troops about to make it look like he was about to cross? Should he fire some cannon across the river? Exactly what McClellan wanted wasn't clear. He left everything to Stone's discretion, and in doing so, he completely exonerated himself from any responsibility. Here you see a map that shows the Maryland side, the Potomac River. In the middle of the river was an island called, and still is there, Harrison's Island. And then across is Virginia. If you moved further to the left of this picture, you would see Leesburg. And if you moved further to the right, you would see Poolesville. So this is the situation. On October 20th, Confederates had been seen at Edwards Ferry, which is actually would be looking, you could see on the map, it says to Edwards Ferry, 3 miles. That's where Stone was. Confederates had been seen there. And Stone went to Edwards Ferry in person and ordered Brigadier General Willie Gordon to display his forces in view of the enemy, to fire shells into the woods, and to put some flatboats in the river to produce the impression that a crossing was about to be made. He also ordered Colonel Charles Devens, of the commander of the 15th Massachusetts, to cross 4 regiments to Harrison's Island and take up a defensive position. In addition, he ordered Devens to detach Captain Chase Philbrick of Company H of the 15th with 20 men to cross from the island into Virginia to see if he could find any enemy there near Leesburg. Philbrick crossed, and is the next one my map? No, that's Charles Devens. He's the commander of the 15th Massachusetts. Anyway, there's my map. I'm sorry, but I drew this. It does give you a general idea. You've got Harrison's Island here in the foreground, the Potomac River. You see to Edwards Ferry, that's where Stone is. There's the Bluff, which is 100 feet high and very steep. It's got growth on it, bushes and trees, and lots of rocks. And there is a path that winds up it. That path is the one Chase Philbrick will use. The very same path is still there. If you've ever been to the battlefield, you know, because you've probably climbed up that path. The path goes through a clearing and then into some woods, and then comes out to a second clearing. Philbrick leads his men through the clearing, through the woods, into the second clearing. And by the time he gets to the second clearing, it's growing dark. He and his men see at the other end of the second clearing, they see about 20 tents. And they figure, uh-oh, that's a Confederate camp. So they go back, cross back to Harrison's Island, give word to Colonel Devens. He sends word to General Stone back at Edwards Ferry. And when Stone finds out what Philbrick had seen, he orders Colonel Devens to cross the 15th and to attack the camp. 2 companies of the 20th Mass are also ordered to cross. They will go to the top of the bluff to provide cover if Devens' men should be forced to return. So at 1:30 a.m. on October 21st, the long roll is heard in the camp of the 15th. It's a drum roll. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It just goes on and on. It awakens the men. And their first sergeant, Hans Jorgensen, tells them, take your blankets, overcoats, and 1 day's rations. There were only 3 boats available to cross from Harrison's Island to Virginia, and each of them could hold only 10 men. So the crossing took most of the night. When the sun came up, it revealed, quote, a rare October day. The leaves were in full bloom with their colors. Philbrick leads Colonel Devens along the path through this woods and into the second clearing to show him where the camp is. But there is no camp, and there never was one. What Philbrick and his men had seen were either haystacks in the field, which looked like tents in the dark, or shadows in the trees, which also looked like tents in the growing dark. Devens put men in the woods and sent word back that there was no camp. Stone ordered 5 more companies of the 15th and 20th to cross. He also sent 11 mounted men to cross and report to Colonel Devens. They crossed, and they reported to Colonel William Lee of the 20th Massachusetts, and then they went back. And they probably could have been of great use, but they weren't available. General Stone did not want to leave Edwards Ferry. Confederates had been seen there. But he needed somebody to go and take command of the troops at Ball's Bluff. And then who should walk into his tent but Colonel Edward D. Baker, the commander of the 71st Pennsylvania. Baker was Lincoln's best friend. They had been lawyers in the same building back in Springfield when they were younger. and developed a wonderful friendship. Such a wonderful friendship that Lincoln named his second child Edward Baker Lincoln. I think that's the next picture. Now, that's a good picture of Ball's Bluff, how steep it was, and you can see the troops are crossing. Um, that's an excellent depiction of it because it still looks like that today. Lots of trees and shrubs and rocks and very steep. Um, anyway, there's Edward Baker. In his civilian attire. He was a senator from California, which is why the 71st Pennsylvania was often called the California Regiment. Um, but he's Lincoln's best friend. In fact, at Lincoln's inaugural back in March, it was Baker who introduced him. Um, Stone placed him in command at Ball's Bluff, and that, I'm afraid, was a fatal mistake. Stone told Baker to go first to Virginia and view the position of Lee and Devon's troops. He could choose to reinforce them if he wished, or he could choose to fall back. But Stone wanted no advance, and he made this very clear, unless the enemy was inferior in numbers. He also told Baker, if you use guns, see that they are well supported by infantry. Now let's move on to, there he is. That is Edward Baker Lincoln, who unfortunately died just before he turned 3 of typhoid fever. The first heartache for Mrs. Lincoln, and Lincoln had already had several when his mother died when he was a kid, and his sister died giving birth, and the baby also died. And then the woman that he loved, oh, I can't remember her name, she also died. They were both young, apparently planning to marry. He adored her. But she's buried not far from where Lincoln is buried. Um, anyway, at 8 a.m. on the 21st, Devens sends skirmishers into a cornfield. This is Company A, which contains my great-great-grandfather Luther and his brother Joseph. And at 8 o'clock, they were fired upon. And one of the soldiers wrote about the sound, the whooshing sound of the bullets coming through the brown corn that had already been harvested. A sharp skirmish began, and it wasn't long before Colonel Lee, who had the 20th back at Ball's Bluff, started seeing wounded men coming his way. The wounded were sent back to Harrison's Island, where the assistant surgeon of the 20th, Dr. Edward Revere, the great-great-grandson of Paul Revere, had set up a hospital in a barn. Colonel Devens placed young Willie Grout, the second lieutenant, in charge of the boats, which were now going to be used to ferry wounded back to Harrison's Island and the hospital. Devens wanted to keep the 18-year-old boy, I mean, he's just a boy, out of harm's way. Stone learned, I'm sorry, Devens appeared, cavalry appeared on Devens' flank. So he ordered the 15th to fall back to the bluff and to form in support of Lee and the 20th. At 10 o'clock, Baker arrived on Harrison's Island, and he told his Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Wister, you must hurry all you can, get everything that can float, cross every man into Virginia. He never went to view the field, as Stone had instructed. He made no effort to contact Devens or Lee. He wanted a fight. He wanted glory. and he was going to see that he got a fight and thought he'd get glory with it. 11:50 a.m., Stone learned through cavalry that there was a large force opposed to Baker. And he sent him a message. Colonel, I am informed that the force of the enemy is about 4,000 all told. And that's about what they had. Baker replied, then there will be the more for us to whip. Fighting begins. The Confederates take a position in the woods. Yeah. And again, here's my poor map, but it does again give you a sense of the troops that the Confederates have. Three different companies from Mississippi, the 13th, 17th, and 18th, the 8th Virginia, and then some Virginia cavalry. Meanwhile, the 15th and 20th, you could see the 15th take a position, creating kind of a backwards L. And the 71st are starting to cross. The 42nd New York are starting to cross. And this is where Baker puts the cannon out in front of the infantry, exposed to the Confederate fire. The Union troops could not see the Confederates. They were in the woods. All they could see were the smoke from their muskets. So they fired at the smoke. At 2 p.m., Baker arrives on the field. And at 2:15, the fighting begins in earnest. Private Roland E. Bowen of the 15th wrote a lot of letters home to a friend of his. And he wrote, of course, this was after the battle, he wrote, now they turned their whole fire upon us, and we had it, give and take, fire and smoke, blood and thunder. Our men came bravely up to the scratch. I should mention that the Union troops here had never been under fire before. They'd never been in battle, whereas the Confederate troops had all fought at Bull Run. They were under the command of a general named Nathan Shanks Evans, who had been at Bull Run. William Bartlett of the 20th Massachusetts said that the bullets were as thick as hailstones, often used to describe thick bullets. At 2:45 p.m., Milton Cogswell arrives at Harrison's Island, preparing to cross with his regiment, the 42nd New York. He's the commander, the colonel, and is a graduate of West Point. He found at Harrison's Island the greatest confusion existing. No one seemed to be in charge, and no order was maintained, which was, Baker didn't care about that. He cared about getting troops over and fighting. At 3 p.m., Baker told his lieutenant colonel, Isaac Wister, I throw the entire responsibility of the left wing upon you. Isaac Wister had never been in combat before. He asked Baker what he should do, and Baker said, do as you like. And then he walked away. You can see this is a disaster waiting to happen. Men were in an open field with their backs to the steep cliff, 100 feet high, beyond which lay the Potomac River, and they only had 3 boats capable of carrying 30 men. If they should be forced to retreat, it would be horrible. Lieutenant Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts wrote his father, it was, in fact, one of the most complete slaughter pens ever devised. And it was. So the fight is going on. First Lieutenant Oliver Wendell Holmes is out in front of his company urging the men on. Maybe you've heard of him before. His father was a famous professor um, at Harvard, and Oliver Wendell Holmes um, was his son. And I'll talk more about him later. But he's out there leading them, says, I'm encouraging them on. He's got his sword, and he said, a bullet knocked the wind out of me, and I fell. It hit him in the chest, and he fell to the ground. And then he started crawling toward the cliff, knowing that down at the beach by the river, the boats were taking wounded back. But his colonel, William Lee, walks by and says, That's right, Mr. Holmes, go to the rear. Well, this kind of angered the young man. He was only 20. He used his sword stuck in the ground to help him pull himself to his feet, and then he returned to his position. And it wasn't long before he was hit a second time. He says, It felt as if a horse had kicked me, hit in the chest a second time. He's taken, he doesn't crawl, he's taken down the bluff to the beach. And he's lying there thinking, I'm hurt pretty bad. And he said, I remembered reading that if you were shot through the lungs, you would surely die. And he said the way to tell if you were shot through the lungs was to spit. And if there was blood in your spit, you were shot through the lungs. Holmes spit, and there was blood in it. Captain William Bartlett, again of the 20th Mass, would later write, The balls flew like hail. The whizzing of the balls was a new sensation. I had read so much about being under fire that I was curious to experience it. I had a fair chance. While this fighting is going on and is getting heavier and heavier, um, Joseph Hapgood is shot in the leg. He falls to the ground and he crawls back to the bluff and makes his way down it, sliding, crawling, rolling, whatever. He gets down to the beach and is put by Willie Grout on a boat to take him back to Harrison's Island. The 42nd New York, when they arrived at Ball's Bluff with Colonel Cogswell, they did a quick attack and they took a lot of casualties. But for the moment, the fighting stopped, but it didn't last long. Baker goes up to Cogswell and says, One blast upon your bugle horn is worth 1,000 men. This comes from Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. Baker asked Cogswell to review his line of battle. Cogswell was an 1849 graduate of West Point, and he later wrote, I told him frankly that I deemed them very defective. There were 1,700 Union and 4,000 Confederates, and the position of the Union was horrid. But you know, the Union soldiers, the Union Army, the Union, Lincoln, McClellan, they're all trying to figure out how to fight this war. This was not the way to do it. The fire continued with terrific fury, wrote Major Paul Revere, also the grandson of the famous writer Paul Revere. Baker is moving along the line, telling the men, Here we go, this is it, this is the battle. And he moves to the left of the line, over by the 42nd New York, and he's hit. He falls to the ground, and then he pulls himself up and stands again. And within seconds, he's hit by 8 different bullets. You see the woods off to the left. There are Confederates now in that woods, and they're flanking the Union position. And that's what has caused Baker's death, because he is killed. A young captain standing next to him had his face and coat splattered with Baker's brains. Um, they carry him back. This is a painting depicting the death of Baker. 8 bullets they found in him. And they did manage to carry his body down the bluff, and it was put on one of the boats as well. Um, Captain Bartlett wrote, if the bullets had rained before, they came in sheets now. Colonel Devens, Colonel Cogswell, and Colonel Lee got together. I don't know what's there. Yeah, let's keep it there. They got together and they actually argued about who's in command now that Baker's dead. And after a discussion, they decided that Cogswell had received his promotion to colonel before the other two. So they all agreed, okay, you're in command. And once he does, he orders a retreat. The 15th Massachusetts will wheel to the left to face the enemy and then will charge. And that's what this drawing is depicting. They're trying to buy time for the other men to retreat, and they will buy about 20 minutes, but they will finally be forced to retreat. And when they do, my great-great-grandfather, Luther Hapgood, he will slide and run and fall down the bluff. And when he gets to the beach, there's a big crowd of men. Some of them can't swim. It wasn't an automatic thing back then. In fact, Colonel Devens couldn't swim. So they're standing around on the beach. And when the Union retreats, when the 15th retreats down the bluff, the Confederates move out of the woods across the clearing and stand at the top of the bluff firing down at the Union troops on the beach. It's total pandemonium. But Joseph gets down there and he's looking for his brother, Luther gets down there and he's looking for his brother Joseph and he can't find him. And he says to a friend in the regiment, have you seen Joseph? And the friend says, Luther, I saw him fall up there. So Luther crawls back up the bluff in an effort to save his brother, not knowing his brother's already on Harrison's Island being attended to. When he gets to the top of the bluff, Luther finds a musket in his face and he is taken prisoner. And it's just horrible, them firing down on the Union troops. Some of them will try to swim, those who can. Others will just mill about on the beach. Some troops from the 15th move up the beach and they find a large kind of a log, not that thick, and they tell Devens, take this and kick your way across the river. And he does, so he survives. But before that happens, Willie Grout sends the last of the boats filled with wounded back to the river, and he stays on the Ball's Bluff side. And it's just a horrible situation. So many men try to get on one of the boats that it sinks. Another of the boats, the oarsmen are paddling it, and the Confederates shoot them. And they fall over, and that sinks, and all their wounded drown. And the third boat also sinks from so many bullets hitting it. The water comes up through it and sinks. There are now no boats, and now it's total panic. Willie Grout goes to Colonel Devens and says, is there anything more I can do? And Devens replies, nothing but take care of yourself. So Grout began to swim the 150 yards back to Harrison's Island. And he wasn't alone. There were a lot of men out there. Captain Bartlett wrote that the Potomac looked like a pond when it rains. So thick were the bullets. Private Roland Bowen is down on the beach, and he will later write, oh, such terrible confusion. men running to and fro, others leaping into the river. The horrid forms of the dead, the last struggles of the dying, the groans of the wounded, and the heart-rending cries that would go up from 100 lips. Heaven forbid that I may ever again witness such a scene as this. Willie Grout gets about halfway across the river swimming when he's hit with a bullet in the back of the head. And he cries out, "Tell Company D I should have escaped, but I am shot." And then he sinks in the water. As General Stone would later put it, there was nothing was left to our soldiers but to swim, surrender, or die. And that was it. If you couldn't swim, you're going to have to surrender. If you could, you tried, but there's no guarantee. And the Confederates are at the top of the bluff just picking off the guys on the beach. And this goes on until it grows dark. Fortunately, it was October, so it got darker earlier than normal, or earlier than in the summer. But eventually, 700 Union soldiers were captured. 400 were killed or wounded, and only 600 escaped unscathed. Unfortunately, my ancestors were not in that lot. One captured, one wounded, one killed. Joseph Hapgood had his leg treated. Um, his wound was not serious. He would be sent home to recover, and he would end up returning to the 15th Massachusetts. What's next? Oh, there's the retreat down the bluff. This is a good picture, but it doesn't give you any idea of how steep that bluff is, still is. It's a wonderful battlefield if you go there. I first went there, I think in '83, and it was pristine. Now they've put up a lot of markers, which I guess is helpful. They haven't really messed with the battlefield at all. The same clearings, the same path, the woods where they're supposed to be. Still pretty pristine. Anyway, um, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the doctor examines him and he says, "Tell me the truth." He says, "Well, you're dying." And so he's in this hospital. And after a few days, he wakes up and feels something in his back. He rolls over. One of the bullets has worked its way out. A few days after that, he's up and walking around. And then he's sent home and he will recover. Doctor was wrong. Um, the day after the battle, October 22nd, Abraham Lincoln went to the telegraph office in the War Department, which back then was just across the street from the White House. He came upon a dispatch announcing the death of Edward Baker. Lincoln left the office with tears rolling down his cheeks, one witness wrote, and he almost fell as he stepped into the street. All of the Lincolns loved Baker. Mary Lincoln loved him because he treated her with respect and kindness, and not everyone did. We now believe that she was bipolar. The entire Lincoln family loved him. The boys, the young boys, um, Willie and Tad, they loved him because he paid attention to them and played with them. And Robert loved him because he knew how much this man loved his parents. So they would have a funeral for Baker in the White House. Meanwhile, in Richmond, um, the prisoners were marched across, I should have said, they were marched across to Manassas, where they could pick up a train to Richmond. And as they did so, they marched across the graves where the soldiers had been buried from First Bull Run. And some witnesses said you could see the fingertips of bones sticking out of the ground. They were buried quickly in shallow graves. So they arrive in Richmond, the prisoners, and then they're herded down the street. One woman shouts at them, "Why don't you take them down the river and make breastworks of them?" And the crowd greeted the prisoners, hooted and hollered and threatened them. They were taken to a three-story tobacco warehouse in Richmond, known as Libby Prison. And they were greeted by, yeah, we have Libby Prison. Oh, there's more. I'm sorry. Of the men in the boats, men trying to swim, um, some men trying to fight the Confederates still, futile. That is Major Paul Revere, who is one of the men taken prisoner um, at this battle. That is Libby Prison. Officers were put on the first floor and they were treated better than others. Enlisted men were put on the second and third floor. Luther Hapgood was put on the third floor. Um, the man in command, or the man that greeted the prisoners, was Sergeant Henry Wurz, who would later be commander at Andersonville Prison and would be the only Confederate executed after the war for war crimes. So he's welcoming these guys to their new home. Um, Meanwhile, Willie Grout's body washes up under what is now the 14th Street Bridge in Washington. It's bloated and not recognizable, but Willie had written his name in his clothes, so they are able to identify him. His parents had some money, so they were able to pay for a metallic coffin, which, if you wanted the body sent home, you had to have. Otherwise, the smell of the decomposing corpse would be too overwhelming. And they paid for his body to be shipped home. Um, a lavish funeral was held. And today in Worcester, or Worcester, as they say up there, there is a VFW named the Willie Grout VFW. He's still remembered. That year, on November 21st, it was Thanksgiving, and the Grout family all gathered in their home, mother, father, two sisters, and they left an empty chair for Willie. They were devastated, as you can imagine. A friend of theirs, a man named Henry S. Washburn, stopped by to pay his respects, and he noticed the empty chair. And so he wrote a poem, which he called The Vacant Chair. And he set it to the music of George F. Root's hymn, School Thy Feelings. And it became a popular song North and South during the war. Um, at our fireside, sad and lonely, often will the bosom swell at remembrance of the story how our noble Willie fell. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. Luther, while in prison, they were fed so poorly, and often their food had maggots in it, that his weight went from 145, he was not tall, only 5'6", down to 95. And he was weak, and too much of this probably would have killed him. He said they were often fed, and I quote, rat soup thickened with rice. And he told another story. He said that one day a Confederate woman and her little girl came to the prison, and she saw Luther and gave him a blanket. He didn't have a blanket, and it's getting cold. Um, and he was grateful for it. And she said to him, I hope that if my husband is captured by the Northern troops, that some Union lady will be kind to him. And the little girl was just staring at Luther. And his mother, the little girl, her mother finally said, "Stop staring. It's impolite." And she said, "Mama, these Yankees look just like my daddy. I thought all Yankees had horns." Anyway, in January of 1862, Republican senators, Roscoe Conkling and Zachariah Chandler, um, pushed to form what was called the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Um, they would harass Lincoln for the rest of the war. And they also, this was such a devastating defeat, they wanted to fix blame. They weren't going to blame Baker, even though the defeat was really his fault. But he was a dead hero, and he was also a close friend of the president. So they looked around for someone else, and they selected Brigadier General George Pomeroy Stone, who it just so happens was a Democrat. He was, quote, tried, condemned, and sentenced before he was even allowed to appear before the Joint Committee. On February 9th, Stone was arrested. He was placed in prison at Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. He was never charged with any crime, so he couldn't really defend it. He sent letters to General McClellan, to President Lincoln, and to the Committee on the Conduct of the War, saying, "What have I done?" No one, no one replied. That disappoints me in Lincoln a little bit. Not really such a compassionate man. On February 22nd, 1862, the rumors had been going around for quite some time, but because it was early in the war, there was a prisoner exchange. As some of you, I'm sure, know, later in the war, Grant would want um, Black Union prisoners to be exchanged, and the South would not allow it. So all exchanges ceased. But Luther Hapgood, Milton Cogswell, and Paul Revere were all exchanged and went home. And Luther began to recover. It would take a long time. On August 16th, 1862, General Stone was suddenly released from prison after 189 days in captivity. He was never told why he was in prison. He was simply released. He could not get another assignment, but General Grant, who was also a compassionate man, he had him serve on his staff. So at least he could continue to serve, which is what he wanted to do. After the war, George Stone would be the chief engineer for the construction of the Statue of Liberty's pedestal in 1883. And shortly after the dedication of the Statue of Liberty, which happened in November of 1886, Stone died at age 62. Major Paul Revere was exchanged. He returned. He wasn't wounded at Ball's Bluff, and he returned to duty in the 20th Massachusetts. And I don't know if you know much about their history, but they in the 15th were part of the Dan Sickles Corps, which he moved without orders off of Cemetery Ridge down into lower ground at the Cadore Farm at Gettysburg. And Major Revere was killed there on the 2nd of July, the second day of the battle. Joseph Hapgood was wounded there in the same leg that he'd been wounded in at Ball's Bluff. and he went home. His war was over now. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, and he died in 1922 at age 82. Roland Bowen, the private who wrote his friend, survived the war, had two children with his wife, and then died of consumption, is what they called it then. We call it tuberculosis today, at age 45 in 1883. Luther S. Hapgood, I'm sorry, this is John William Grout's grave in a Worcester cemetery where he was buried. This is my great great grandfather, Luther S. Hapgood. I wish I had a picture of him like I do his brother as a young man in uniform. This is him as an older man in his GAR uniform. He survived, obviously, but he never returned to the 15th. Um, he was placed in a veterans regiment doing duty behind the lines. Um, uh, while he was home, he got married, and after the war, he inherited the family dairy farm. During World War I, he used to say, "When I fought in the Great Rebellion, we fought with our fists and bayonets, and you had to look in the eyes of the man you were going to kill." My Aunt Gladys, my mother's oldest sister, who was born in 1910, remembered as a little girl at every family gathering, Luther would say, "Come on, kids, come on, gather around. I'm going to tell you about the Great Rebellion." She said she was so bored because he told the same stories over and over. Oh, what I wouldn't give to hear those stories. But she's the one that gives me these quotes from him, both in prison and after the war. She said that he used to say, "I'm a damn Yankee and damn proud of it." And he died in 1923 at the age of 87. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. returned to the 20th Massachusetts, and at Antietam, he was shot through the neck, and the newspapers listed him as dead. His father, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., went down to the Antietam battlefield to collect his body, and he wrote about it in an article in Atlantic Magazine called "My Search for the Captain." Imagine his surprise and joy when he finds his son alive and healing. He would go home and his war would be over. But in 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt would appoint him to the Supreme Court. He would be known as the Great Dissenter and would serve for 3 decades, dying in 1935, just 2 days shy of his 95th birthday. He would write, "In our youths, our hearts were touched with fire," as indeed they were.
This is a great presentation, Mark. I appreciate you coming in and doing
You're
this.
very kind.
Yeah, very good. And I look forward to seeing this on YouTube because then it'll go out to the people who couldn't make it today. It's a beautiful day today. So with that, unless there's any other questions, I'll let you go. And I want everyone to have a good day and be safe out there. And God bless.